250 psi. That's the maximum pressure the hydraulic pump of a John Deere 4020 can force into its cylinders. A thrust strong enough to lift tons of steel, tearing through the tar-thick black dirt of Illinois without a single stutter. But 2,250 psi means nothing against a 20% interest rate choking the life out of Dean Hoffman. $700,000 in debt, a catastrophic physical failure you can't fix by turning a wrench or replacing a seal. Noon, June 1985. If you were standing next to me on the Hoffman farm's dead grass right then, you would have smelled the disaster. It wasn't hidden in ledgers. It radiated from the burnt stench of gear oil boiling out of overworked transmissions, mixed with the sour sweat of men about to lose their wives and homes. I was bent over peeling the finance decal off the 4020's hood. 5 steps away, 3 bank reps from Chicago stood like gray stone statues, punching numbers into their calculators, not saying a word. The silence of men holding the knife by the handle is always thicker and more suffocating than any screaming engine. Dean Hoffman leaned against a rotting wooden fence. 13 years ago, he stormed into my shop, slammed a fistful of cash on the counter, and demanded the meanest beast we had. I sold him that dream, a PTO spinning at 1,000 RPM, a cast alloy chassis that didn't yield to boulders, an engine that chewed through 160 acres before you could finish half a pack of cigarettes. Dean believed horsepower could outrun time, and time would breed money. He pushed the machine 18 hours a day. I saw the winch cables on his rigs pull so taut that the grease squeezed out of the core like drops of black sweat. Material fatigue is real. Human fatigue is, too. And Carl, his younger brother? Every time we mentioned Carl, us mechanics would spit on the shop floor and sneer. Carl refused every upgrade. He clung to his old man's 1952 Farmall Super M, a pile of scrap iron. You have no idea how dangerous that thing is. Open combustion chamber, hacking and rattling like a tubercular lung. No sealed cab, no WASI. And the worst part? No power steering. I watched Carl drag that Farmall into the shop just to replace a cheap cotter pin. I watched him grip that freezing iron steering wheel, muscles strung tight. That prehistoric mechanical steering linkage sent every shock from the dirt straight up his arms. Every rock, every deep rut snapped the wheel back. This torque is going to grind your wrist cartilage to dust before you're 40, Carl, I told him once, throwing a greasy rag onto the concrete. Why keep a 20-year-old tractor? You think bone and muscle can beat hydraulic gears? Carl just stayed quiet, shoved a crumpled bill into my hand, climbed onto that bone-rattling seat and drove off. We watched his trail of blinding black smoke, placing bets on whether his spine would snap before his bank account did. A man who rejects technology digs his own grave. That was the most basic law of physics in this economy. But today, every law flipped. Dean's polished John Deere 4020 was just hammered down by the auctioneer for $4,200. High-grade steel is just scrap when its owner goes bankrupt. Dean dropped his head. The mechanical beast he fed with credit had just bitten his throat out. Moving on to the real estate. The auctioneer's voice ripped through the air. The north 80 acres. Prime black soil. Let's start at $300 an acre. The speculator vultures shifted. Hands went up. $350. $400. I looked at Dean. His eyes were dead black. The centrifugal force of greed had drained him dry, throwing him off the very land his bloodline had rooted in for 50 years. $400 an acre. Dirt cheap. A numerical insult. $450. A voice broke out. Hoarse, dry as a worn gear slipping a tooth. It didn't come from the suits. I whipped around. The bank reps stopped punching their calculators. Carl Hoffman pushed through the crowd. He was still wearing that canvas jacket stained black with axle grease, his cracked boots caked with dried mud. The farmer who ran a prehistoric machine, the coward who never dared to expand, was standing face to face with the most cold-blooded financial systems in Chicago. The speculator paused for a beat, eyeing Carl from head to toe like measuring the tensile strength of a fraying cable. He smirked. $500. Right then I saw the muscle in Carl's jaw twitch. $40,000. Christ. Where did that fool find the compressive strength to withstand this kind of crushing price? Carl took a step forward. His calloused hand, knuckles likely deformed from 13 years of wrestling the Farmall's unassisted steering, slowly rose into the air. 550, Carl said. The number hung in the humid air like heavy exhaust smoke on a windless day. The Chicago suit scoffed, his eyes darting as his brain crunched the math. $44,000 for an 80-acre graveyard. He lowered his paddle. The friction was too high. The return didn't pencil out. Sold at $550 to the man in the grease-stained coat. When that gavel cracked, I swear I felt a phantom tremor run through the soles of my work boots. Carl didn't flinch, but his knees locked hard. I know that stance. It's the rigid posture of a structural strut taking a load just barely past its rated capacity. I found out later he only had 38 grand saved up. 15 years of bleeding kinetic energy into a static cash reserve. He was 6 grand short of the hammer price. Before the clerk could demand the deposit, a heavy, weathered hand clamped onto Carl's shoulder. Harold Bennett, an old-timer whose joints popped louder than a cold-starting diesel engine. "I've got the other 6, Harold grunted. "Your daddy pulled my rig out of the flood dirt in '68. We're square." I looked over at Dean. The man who tried to turbocharge his way to an empire was sobbing into his hands, completely stripped of his gears. Then I looked at Carl. For 13 years my crew and I had mocked him. We thought his refusal to finance new iron was just a lack of horsepower. We were dead wrong. If you've ever watched a solid block of cast iron drop onto a hollow aluminum frame, you know exactly what happens. The aluminum crumples. Carl wasn't slow. He was dense. He was solid. He had built an operation with zero financial leverage. When the economic gravity inverted and tore everyone else's over-leveraged frames apart, Carl didn't have a single structural weak point to snap. You can't rebuild a blown engine without stripping it down to the bare block. That's exactly what happened to Dean. He lost the house, the shiny trucks, the blinding pride. He hauled his bags into Carl's cramped 2-bedroom farmhouse, stripped of every aftermarket modification he thought made him a king. The following spring, I drove my service truck out to the Hoffman place to drop off a barrel of 15W40 oil. I parked on the gravel ridge and looked down at the valley. Deep in the black dirt, that ancient 1952 Farmall Super M was dragging a plow. It was coughing its usual black soot, shaking like a mismatched drive shaft. But it was pulling, and Dean was the one driving it. I watched him wrestle that unassisted iron steering wheel, the exact same wheel I swore would shatter his brother's wrists. Dean wasn't trying to break speed records anymore. He wasn't pushing the RPMs into the red line. He was just finding the groove, letting the tractor's raw, heavy torque do the work. Carl was walking the fence line ahead, clearing rocks. 2 gears, finally meshing without grinding each other to dust. It took 7 years, but in 1992, Carl sold half the North 80 back to Dean for the exact auction price. 0 interest, 0 markup. Debt is a chain drive running with no lubrication. Eventually, the friction burns the whole machine down. But whatever Carl and Dean rebuilt out there, that was welded solid. I'm retired now, hands too stiff to turn a wrench. But I still hear it every spring. That old Farmall, 70 years old, firing up across the valley. We thought we were the smart ones, worshiping horsepower and credit. But Carl knew the ultimate law of mechanics. A machine owned by the bank will never truly pull your weight. Let me tell you what happened to that shiny John Deere 4020. The beast Dean bought to conquer the world. I saw its carcass in a salvage yard near Decatur back in '98. The block was cracked. The axles were stripped for donor parts. It was cannibalized, its pieces scattered across the state. That's the lifespan of a machine built on borrowed time. It evaporates. But that Farmall? It's still sitting in the Hoffman barn, over 70 years old. A stubborn chunk of cast iron that refused to die. Dean's grandkids farm that land now. They use modern rigs, sure, but they buy them with cold, hard cash. I ran into Dean at the parts counter just before Thanksgiving a few years back. He's an old man now, his hands shaking, skin like cured leather. He told me about their family dinners. Before they carve the bird, he makes the new generation listen to the physics of failure. "I tell them about the banks," Dean rasped, leaning heavily on the counter. "I tell them a loan is a high-pressure valve that you don't control. You let some suit in a city hold the release lever. When the market overloads, they don't blow their lines. They blow yours. Us mechanics, we spend our lives trying to cheat friction. We invent synthetic oils, forge stronger alloys, build bigger hydraulic pumps. We think we can out-engineer the basic laws of reality. But Carl Hoffman didn't try to cheat. He accepted the friction. He knew that the only way to survive a catastrophic system failure is to owe absolutely nothing to the system. They used to call that old Farmall a museum piece. Nonsense. A museum piece is dead. That red iron in the Hoffman barn is a living gauge, a reminder that survival isn't about running at maximum RPMs. It's about building a chassis that never cracks. When Carl's heart finally gave out in 2019, there was no catastrophic blowout, no alarms. He just powered down quietly, like a well-maintained engine that simply ran out of fuel after decades of flawless operation. I stood at the back of the Methodist Church cemetery, my arthritic hands shoved deep into my coat pockets, watching Dean stare at his brother's casket. People think forgiveness is some soft church pew concept. It isn't. To a mechanic, forgiveness is industrial work. It's taking a stripped, mangled bolt hole and painstakingly tapping a fresh thread into it. It requires cutting through the damaged steel, aligning the tap perfectly straight, and turning it by hand until the new grooves bite. One wrong move and you snap the bit, ruining the block forever. Carl tapped a new thread into Dean's life when Dean had absolutely zero structural integrity left. And it held. It held for the rest of their lives. After the funeral, I drove past the Hoffman farm one last time. Dean, 82 years old and bent like a warped tie rod, was walking alone toward the barn. I pulled over and cut my engine. I knew exactly what he was doing. A minute later, I heard it. The heavy, rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the 1952 Farmall Super M firing up. Dean drove it slowly out into the spring sunlight. The red paint was faded to the color of dried blood, the tires worn almost bald, but the engine hummed with a perfectly balanced idle. I leaned against the steering wheel of my truck and smiled bitterly at my own past arrogance. 30 years ago, under that scorching sun in 1985, I thought the smartest guys in the room were the engineers building 100-horsepower turbo diesels and the bankers writing 7-figure loans. I thought I knew how the world worked. But the numbers failed. The high-pressure systems exploded. The aluminum empires tore themselves to shreds. The only thing that survived the blast radius of human greed was a stubborn old man, his bankrupt brother, and a prehistoric chunk of cast iron that simply refused to owe anyone a damn dime. I rolled up my window, shifted into drive, and left them to their land. Some machines aren't built for speed. They're built to outlast the storm. Today, the kids driving the big rigs don't even steer. Satellites drive the tractors. Microchips regulate the fuel injectors. If a single sensor fails, you don't grab a steel wrench, you call a software engineer. The machines cost $1 million, financed at floating rates. I watch them roll off the dealership lots, and I smell it all over again. That same phantom stench of boiling gear oil and impending foreclosure. The cycle repeats. Another generation leveraging their blood against digital ledgers. But not on the Hoffman farm. I saw Dean's grandson, little Walter, at the hardware store last week. He bought a massive grease gun and a box of shear pins, paid in cash. He told me they just bought a used steel rig. Saved up 3 years of harvest profits, he said. Paid the invoice flat. No bank. No lien. No digital tether back to Chicago. I asked him if the old Farmall was still kicking. Walter grinned. Grandpa Dean makes me service it every Sunday. Says if I cannot feel the backlash in a mechanical gear, I do not deserve the digital ones. That is the final truth. You can digitize the harvest. You can map the topsoil. But you cannot bypass the fundamental physics of ownership. Debt is a fault line invisible to the naked eye. It hides beneath the shiny green paint and the touchscreen monitors, waiting for the economic tectonic plates to shift. When the next crash hits, and it will hit because friction never sleeps, a lot of these expensive satellite marvels will get locked out by bank codes. They will sit dead in the mud. But out on the South 80, a stubborn red chunk of analog iron will crank over, free, clear, and owned by Hoffman family blood and pure sweat. I sit in my own garage now. The air smells like solvent and settling dust. I'm wiping down a half-inch drive torque wrench I bought in 1970. It doesn't have a digital LCD screen. It doesn't beep. It relies on a heavy internal coil and a mechanical click that reverberates right up your radius bone when you hit the exact right tension. It tells the physical truth. That's a rare commodity these days. We live in an era of least realities. I look at the new crop of operators out there signing end-user license agreements just to start their engines. They don't own those machines. They're just renting the software. The second they miss a loan payment, a server in some air-conditioned high-rise sends a remote kill signal, and a 100,000-pound rig turns into a dead paperweight. Carl Hoffman never needed a software patch. He didn't need a corporate unlock code to drop his plow into the dirt. He just needed diesel, compression, and oxygen. The bank suits from Chicago, they thought they were the apex predators of the plains. But they were just playing a rigged game of paper and digits. Real wealth isn't a massive line of credit. Real wealth is the absolute, unbreakable physics of ownership. It's the ability to turn an ignition switch and know, down in your gut, that no man on earth can legally shut you down. I snap the latch on my toolbox. The heavy steel lid comes down with a solid, echoing thud. I've spent 50 years fixing machines that men destroyed, trying to play God with time and yield. I've seen aluminum empires rise on paper and melt in the sun. The only monument left standing is that faded red Farmall. It survived not because it was the fastest, but because it was the only machine that didn't belong to the bank. It belonged to the dirt, and the dirt always wins. Last October, the sky over Champaign turned the color of a burnt clutch plate. A massive atmospheric storm, followed by some solar flare anomaly the news talked about for weeks, knocked out the RTK positioning networks across the entire Midwest. For 3 days, the county ground to a dead halt. I sat on my porch and listened to the absolute silence. It was eerie. Millions of dollars of high-tech iron sat paralyzed in the fields because their microchips couldn't talk to a satellite floating in the stratosphere. The modern operators were trapped in their climate-controlled cabs, staring at flashing red error codes, completely immobilized by a dropped signal. But on the second morning of the blackout, the wind shifted, and I heard it. Thump, thump, thump. I fired up my beat-up Chevy and drove down to the gravel ridge overlooking the Hoffman spread. Down there in the valley, their modern tractor was parked near the silo, dark and useless. But right out in the middle of the acreage, chewing through the muddy stalks of harvested corn, was the 1952 Farmall Super M. Dean's grandson, little Walter, was at the wheel. He wasn't relying on lasers or algorithms to cut a straight line. He was using his eyes, his shoulders, and the brutal physical feedback of the steering column. He was dragging a heavy steel disc harrow, turning the soil over, preparing the earth for the winter freeze. The exhaust pipe spat a rhythmic column of black soot into the gray sky, a steady pulse of analog defiance. That is the ultimate failsafe. When the digital grid collapses, when the servers crash, and when the financial algorithms finally eat themselves alive, the earth doesn't care. The soil still needs to be turned, and the men who survive won't be the ones holding iPads or credit applications. It will be the men holding greasy wrenches, riding cast-iron machines that don't need a network connection's permission to run. Last week I drove out to the Hoffman place for what I knew would be the last time. My arthritis has gotten so bad I can barely hold a coffee cup, let alone swing a breaker bar. I wasn't there for a service call. I was there to hand off a piece of history. I walked into the main barn. It didn't smell like a sterile dealership showroom. It smelled like raw diesel, cured hay, and 50 years of honest sweat. Little Walter was under the 1952 Farmall, covered in grease, torquing down a drain plug. Old Dean sat nearby on a wooden crate, his breathing shallow, watching the boy work. "Don't over-tighten it, Walt," Dean rasped. "Iron threads strip if you force them. Just let it seat." I walked over and set a heavy canvas roll on the workbench. It was my original set of analog feeler gauges and micrometer calipers from 1968, the exact tools I used to maintain this very tractor before the world went digital. Walter slid out from under the chassis and wiped his hands on a rag. I pushed the canvas roll toward him. "You can't plug a laptop into an open combustion engine, kid," I told him. "These gauges measure physical clearance, gap space, the real distance between two pieces of moving metal. Use them, and this machine will outlive you too." Walter took the heavy tools with a reverence you usually only see in church. Dean looked up at me from his crate. We didn't need to say much. We were two old ghosts who had survived the slaughterhouse of the 1980s. "She still holds compression," Dean said softly, nodding at the tractor. "Because Carl never let the system over-rev her," I replied. Dean smiled, a tired, genuine smile. "I spent my whole youth trying to buy an empire on credit, Hutch. Took me losing it all to realize Carl already owned the only empire that mattered. I left the barn feeling a strange sense of relief. The tools were in the right hands. The bloodline had been rethreaded. The next generation understood the load-bearing weight of $1 earned versus $1 borrowed. Every internal combustion engine has a point called top dead center. It's the exact millisecond when the piston reaches its highest point, the fuel is fully compressed, and the spark ignites. It is the moment of maximum pressure before the release of raw power. Life has a top dead center, too. For the Hoffman family, it was that blistering June day in 1985. The pressure was lethal. The bank held the spark. Dean was supposed to be blown to ash. But Carl absorbed the blast. He took the concussive force of the financial collapse on his own solid cast-iron shoulders and kept the family intact. I sit on my porch now as the sun drops below the Illinois horizon. The sky bleeds into a deep bruised purple. Out there, past the gravel roads and the highway, the suits in Chicago are still playing their games. They are writing new derivatives, packaging new loans, inventing new digital mirages to sell to young men hungry for speed and scale. They think they run the world. But I've been a mechanic for 50 years, and I know the ultimate law of physics. Friction always collects its debt. When the next bubble bursts, when the algorithms fail and the digital screens go black, the leverage will snap again. The over-leveraged frames will buckle. The paper empires will burn. But beneath the ashes, anchored deep in the black dirt of Champaign County, something will remain. A patch of land completely free of liens, a family that knows the difference between a tool and a trap, and a 1952 Farmall Super M, dripping a little oil, smelling of raw diesel, ready to crank over. It turns out the smartest guys in the room weren't the bankers with their spreadsheets, or the engineers with their turbochargers, or even loudmouth mechanics like me. The smartest man was the quiet one in the grease-stained coat, who knew that the only way to truly win the race is to own your machine, free and clear, right down to the very last bolt.